Hi there, this is Billie Tarascio with the Modern Divorce Podcast, and today I am joined by the Spunky Spiritualist, Dr. Tiffany Nguyen. How are you doing today?
Hi, Billie. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you, the Spunky Spiritualist, have made a very interesting niche for yourself. Tell our audience about who you are and what you do.
So, I am a spiritual life coach or mentor, and also a pharmacist. And I work with typically busy professional or high achiever who are sensitive, in touch with their emotions, and to help them to reconnect with their own truth by tracing their own patterns, thought patterns, so they can have the fulfilling relationship that they want and the dream life that they want.
Okay, so my first question is, how does a pharmacist become a life coach?
I still work full time as a pharmacist because I do enjoy medicines. I think life coach is barely just like another label for a teacher. And I'm
Mhm.
always a big believer in spirituality. And science and spirituality are quite complementary. I'm Buddhist, so it's a lot of the method, like especially like questioning and critical thinking, are very similar. So I do read tarot, so it's quite a good complementary to bring up the intuitive side. So I do think each of us have all of that part in ourselves, like we all have like this skeptic part of us, and also part of us like to believe in the mystical and the magical. So it's just basically a combination of combining them and integrating them both.
I love that. You've got like Eastern and Western medicine, and you are able to know both, take the best of both, and help people create their very best life. Now, you find yourself working often with people who are going through transitions from breakups or divorces. Is that right?
Yes, most of the
Okay.
time.
Okay. All right. And so tell me, how do you go about that engagement typically? Like somebody comes to you and they're either, thinking about getting a divorce or they've just gone through divorce. Like how do you help them?
So I help them by tracing, first of all, their pattern in the relationship by going through with, first of all, like their most intimate relationship with basically their spouse or significant others, to see like looking all of their history and also the behavior in the most recent relationship to see what kind of behavior and what drove them to have that, what drive them to have those kind of behavior.
Mhm.
And typically, a lot of things will come up that we kind of behave very similarly in most of our intimate relationship,
Yeah.
and we tend to attract the same type of persons in
Mhm.
across our history, and so sometimes it's not desirable. Sometimes we keep attracting losers or like people that don't appreciate us, take us for granted. Just like a lot of stuff kind of patterns. So kind of dive into it. A lot of them come from just from our circumstances. Most of us have childhood bias in childhood that we already get, upbringing are different, and we have different culture, different family, different religion, and then add on that when we grow up, we have personal experience. Add on top of that, so sometimes a lot of bad experience, like let's say we witness our parents with terrible relationship, that can traumatize us, and then later on our past relationship can be also traumatizing, and then also that's just influence our kind of judgment and how we think the world work and what we do to get certain type of result, and then we just go on and think of it as like the reality and that's just the truth of it, and that's not always the true, and sometimes we just get stuck in that cycle and it's hard to break out of if we don't know how to step out of it and have a good reason for it. um,
Sure.
so that usually that's where I start, and then I tracing back and then expand it to other relationship. Typically with other like relationship with friends and family, because um, So one of my strengths is tracing people thought patterns. They can just tell me, and then I would tell them, like, pinpoint out the origin. Okay, like, you acted this way because this happened, and it make you feel this way. You think this way, kind of like that. And we human, we might be only show like our professional side in our career, but in our relationship, it's hard to avoid to have a lot of side of us come out, like our badness, our bad and good sides, our quirkiness, our weakness. So a lot of those come out of relationships. So that's why when we trace the those kind of patterns, is a big chunk of that can reflect to the own pattern of to our own relationship with ourselves. And basically the ultimate goal is basically to reconnect with ourselves and to see how we view ourselves and go from there. And once we change it, then we shift everything else. So usually, typically what my most of my former clients experience after they come up from a divorce or a breakup, and we work through a lot of these, and their lives start to change. A lot of their friendship also fall away. So it's experienced like another catastrophe. So like a lot of relationships fall away because it's no longer aligned with who they are. Sometimes, most of the time, job change also because either they just don't vibe anymore. So either they leave the job voluntarily or something happened that they let go or something like that. But typically it takes up time. And then their world, maybe in a few years when they look back, then it changed completely different. Yeah, different.
Yeah, it's a great point. Like when people do go through a divorce, it's such a massive transition. You know, we all get married with a certain set of beliefs, and that belief is till death do us part, and we mean it. And we mean
Yeah.
it while we're married. We mean it every year we're married. We congratulate ourselves for making it through the years where we maybe don't even like our spouse because we made it and that was hard and that was what we wanted to do and we did it. And so we congratulate ourselves and we think we're such a good person. And then, you know, when it falls apart, then wait a second, am I no longer a good person? And then my friends might think I'm not a good person, and maybe my religion doesn't think I'm a good person. And then you start thinking, well, wait a second, you know. And then this domino effect happens. At the same time, many people who are going through divorce lose their minds, have a hard time concentrating at work, maybe don't perform well, end up, you know, so you've got this ripple effect of changes that is sort of like inevitable. How do you harness that and find the good?
So a lot of those challenges are basically our opportunity to grow. So because a divorce, no matter who initiated it or what happened or what drive it, is painful. And we cannot find like a good, perfect coping mechanism that just completely forget the pain. And it's precisely those pain that make us very honest and open compared to before. So like when someone that is like tethering on the divorce, they suffer a lot of like hesitancy, analysis, decision analysis, paralysis. And then they also have a lot of depression most of the time. And but once they get past that kind of milestone, like divorce or breakup, there's nothing but grief, just a lot of pain. And that pain, they cannot deny it. They cannot be in denial, like, okay, the relationship is over. There's no way they can be in denial of that, which can happen when they haven't divorced yet or something like that. Then we tend to be in denial, like, yeah, the relationship is fine, we're probably gonna work it out, but it cannot. So that pain makes us very honest and give us a window to give us a choice to either to take a real look at reality and about ourselves, or we just, of course, we still have to feel the pain, but sometimes when it's too much and overwhelming, a lot of us, most of us, what we would do, we would just find a coping mechanism, either Netflix and ice cream, and then just forget about it after some time and just moving forward, and never actually sit down and examine and figure out what went wrong, what we can learn from it. And So that usually what would happen. So what I find that most common and most typical, I work with everyone. So everyone comes to me and have the same is self-worth, like especially after divorce, it's like self-worth is completely shot. It's like completely zero.
Yeah.
But one of these, I guess, so this is like, I guess, unveil the secret, I guess. The most common thing that most of us, when we get into, make the vow of marriage, we were, 2 decades apart, and we took this commitment very seriously. I think we focus on the wrong part. We focus on how do we make that commitment, and we assume that everything stays the same, and we're gonna be like that until the end of our life. But the reality is, the truth is, the person we marry will never be the person that we dated. So it's we change every day as a human being, all of us, and we forget that often. So when we marry our spouse, we expect them to behave a certain way in every circumstances, whether they're sick or whether something happens. But people do change, and we forget that. And that a lot of time, a lot of misery came from how we resistant to accept that our spouse and our significant other and also ourselves have changed. Our expectation and our wants have changed. But we just want them to stay the same or to behave like very similar way when we first know them. And that caused a lot of heartbreak and disappointment. So that's one of the big things. And that's very hard to accept too, because it make us feel in a way kind of insecure, because basically the person we marry today will be very different during honeymoon, and will be very different after honeymoon, and it will be different the next day. So
yeah, I mean, the ideal scenario is you marry somebody who has the same growth potential as you do, and you grow together. But what I see that often happens is the growth potentials aren't the same. And so somebody will max out about here and somebody else will keep going. And then there's this big resentment both ways. And that can be really hard. Like at a certain point, now you're no longer compatible where you were here. Maybe you were compatible and then you're not anymore. And there's always shame because it always feels like a failure. One question I wanted to ask you is, a lot of people are stuck in a victim mentality. They were perfect. They did everything they could. Their ex is abusive, will never change. How do you help those people?
So it depends on how severe the situation is. Sometimes it's when you're a victim, then you are really a victim. There's a lot of like manipulation tactic being used against you, especially with abuser. They are great manipulator, great gaslighting technique. First of all, you should know that relationship need to be safe, physically and emotionally, and that is the most essential quality for all relationship, no exception. And what happened in like intimate relationship, we tend to have this kind of forgive and like, okay, like maybe they didn't mean it or something like that. And it take our power away. But for those people that are actually in crisis, they actually need to, first of all, awareness to recognize that this is not normal and this is not healthy. And they really need help to find safety, and they will need to contact professional and helpline and hotline to actually help them out, especially with abuser if they in danger physically and also emotionally, because emotionally manipulation is very, very difficult to deal
And
with.
it's
Also
common. It's really common. I mean, most of the people that I talk to have been emotionally manipulated, and of course by the time they're getting a divorce, the relationship is not safe. It's just not. Now many people evolve beyond that and get to a point where they can coexist as co-parents, and there is enough safety there. Like your relationship, you don't have to be partners anymore. You don't.
Yeah.
You just have to coexist and be able to send a minimal amount of messages. How do people determine when they are experiencing emotional safety and when they need to just cut that conversation off immediately?
So technically, for emotionally, if they feel like, okay, this is talking about like on like a frequency basis. It's okay, like if they angry and yelling and screaming, definitely gonna happen because we're human. But on a frequently basis, if you have to wait for the other person, have to be in certain kind of mood, have to be like, and we have to word ourselves in different way because we are afraid of a certain outcome, that means it's not safe. Immediately, that is not safe. If you have to wash your tongue so much and you have to walk on an eggshell, that is not safe. If you're afraid to tell them something, like if you're even afraid to show your negative emotion, if you're afraid to show that you're sad or to show that you're upset, that is the big sign that is totally not safe, not emotionally safe. And that is a big sign. And I think once the people gain the awareness that they don't have that kind of safety, and I hope they have enough of the social support outside of it, like family support or friend support, to gain enough courage to walk away. Because the recovery it's gonna be a long road for it, because the emotional damage can be difficult to recover, but it definitely can. But they need to build up that courage and to walk away from it.
So many times people may not be ready to end a relationship, but they might know they're right where you're talking about. They're in a bad place. How can they set a boundary to create safety without saying our marriage is over?
That's gonna be a lot of people gonna start doing that as a disengagement.
Yeah.
So you don't have to. Basically, when a lot of things happen, you do your best to not engage in a conversation and start to have that. That is like the most boundary you can have in an unsafe relationship, is to protect your space and to walk away from a lot of engagement, to disengage from conversation.
So that is certainly the pattern. The pattern is conflict, disengagement. One person stops trying, they separate, they go, even within the same house, they separate. But that doesn't lead to a healthy relationship. Is
No.
there anything that you can do to set a boundary and begin to make your relationship healthier, or you simply doomed?
I think it depends on the relationship itself, how safe or unsafe it is. If it's, let's say, if the person is a narcissistic, then it's very unlikely that it's gonna work out, because they naturally lack empathy and sympathy. If it's the other person, by circumstances, let's say they're having a hard time and they just change into different persons, then they probably the relationship at itself can use a lot of good help from counselor, couple therapy, and that can be worked out. Or like when, let's say they are dealing with the aftermath of a betrayal or infidelity, they can use, couple therapy and try to dealing, and clear communication is good. And they have to learn how to have safety and talk about it. Basically people have to be both in like a more like a calm mood and sit down and have a serious conversation and be very clear and upfront about it. So that is one way. But it's gonna be much more muddled if there are children and other involved. Then it's gonna be much more difficult to work out. For like, they need to set a realistic expectation. Like, do you want it to be like kind of fulfilling relationship from an unsafe relationship, that is very hard. But if you just want like separation into a point that you have a good like a safe boundary into like the space between you kind of safe to do what you need to do. But
well, yeah, so there's a difference between a relationship that's functional and a relationship that's fulfilling. And many people who are married would be happy with functional.
sure.
And they're not at a functional situation. And I think that like the point you just made is so important. If you can go to counseling and it gets better, maybe you can find some safety and some functionality in your relationship.
Right.
If you go to counseling and you can't,
Then
nothing gets better, nobody's receptive to anything, then it's a matter of time, and you need to start like facing reality and planning your long-term exit.
Just start planning. Yeah, you have to start to plan your exit. There's no other way about it. Once you start disengage, once you I think this is in general pattern, like once you recognize that the relationship is unhealthy and toxic and unsafe, first you have to recognize it's like savable or not. If you're willing to put in the work, gonna be a shitload of work. But also people, you need to know that all relationships have to be two-way street. It doesn't matter if you're the only person willing to do that, then it's never gonna work out. I'm sorry, don't waste your effort, don't waste your time. It's never gonna work out if only one person is willing. But if two people are willing to put in the effort, then there is still hope. But be aware, because when you are emotionally manipulated, it's so easy to think that the other person is willing because they can be lying to you and they're not. So be aware of that. But technically, like I said, if it's like a narcissistic or a physically abuser or emotionally abuser, your best plan is to find safety and plan to exit. There's unlikely that it's going to work out, even a functional one.
Right. What are the biggest mistakes that you see people make when they're going through that process of exiting a relationship?
They want to give up on the exit plan because it's very hard to be on their own, and want to go back and regret. And there's a lot of like, what if, what if he meant it this time, or what if he getting better now, like he got a new job now and it's getting better or whatever. And it's usually is those regret, those what if, and there's not enough courage, and they will go back. I would say that's to be the biggest relapse. That basically you're in denial of yourself, like you trying to build up a lot of counter argument to not do what you set out to do, go back on it.
What is the best way for people to kind of confront and work through that doubt and fear?
It will be accountability. The best scenario is they have a supportive person or supportive network around them. It might not be even like the whole network. It might just be need one person that they can be very honest to it, and they can hold you, they can hold them accountable. And they can, because they're not involved in your relationship, even though they know everything about the relationship, but they're not they're not personally involved in it. So they don't get swayed by things that happen and by your self-doubt and by a lot of things. So they can hold you accountability. So accountability is really, and support. Hopefully you get the accountability from a supportive person. That will be the biggest support, and that will be the best way to go. But yeah, the exit plan can be very difficult, especially say for somebody that for years that have been dependent on their spouse, or having no independence, have getting used to that, started to develop a lot of dependency, or somebody that be responsible for the children, raising the children by their own. And it's going to be much more difficult to be on your own and in the wild world when you have to be on yourself. So it can be a bigger judgment, but it's got to be the biggest, best step you're going to take.
It's true. You know, people are really rarely as happy as they are when they leave a very toxic relationship. And you know, usually 2 to 3 years after that exit, people are like, I didn't know life could be so good.
Yeah, immediately the very short time after leaving a toxic relationship feel very difficult. The first of all is unfamiliar because you haven't been like that, and second of all, this sounds like an oxymoron, but it's very true. You don't like you have that so much freedom and so much space because you're not used to it. You're just not used to it. You always tend to work in like a very tight space and very, you know, like certain kind of guideline, because in the relationship, you know, in the toxic relationship, you set the kind of certain way that you behave, so you be sure that you're not being bothered or not too much. But once that's gone away, you don't get constantly triggered, and now you just sit here with all of your negative emotions, all of your baggage coming up, and suddenly there's a lot more space and you just feel all of these things, and then you have a lot of freedom. Before, you kind of not having your freedom because you kind of get pushed into doing certain things that you might not totally want. But now that you have freedom and you have basically decision analysis, like, I don't know what to do because I'm not used to this kind of freedom to make choices and to make difficult choices. But the most difficult choice you already made is to walk away. So kudos for that. But yeah, after that, there's a lot of like doubt that set in for this short term because it's so difficult and it's so overwhelming. And it's also can feel very isolated. A lot of people in manipulated relationships, they become more isolated from their social circle. They don't have a lot of you know, like flourishing relationship with friends or with family. They tend to be more isolated. So when they walk away from that intimate relationship, it's feel very bereft and feel very isolated. And that is like a strong factor that make people want to go back, because at least it's the misery that they know. But hold on tight, because yeah, definitely it's really different in a few years. So it's just like this huge learning curve.
So how do people find you and how do people work with you?
So they can find me on my website, spunkyspiritualist.com. I only have Facebook, it's under the same name, Spunky Spiritualist. I do have a program for one-on-one, which is we go through your own pattern relationship and basically ultimately go to your pattern relationship with yourself. And once you have a strong foundation with yourself, then you can basically your life will be transformed from the inside out. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really interesting episode, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.